there is stuff going on that anybody with a moral compass should think, you know what, this is outside the bounds of the possible. So yes, if I could wave a magic wand, I would say be done with this fever. But there always has to be that room, that space for optimism to say, all right, there is a silver lining here, or there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Hello and welcome to AnthroTalk, the podcast about all things anthropology and humanity. I'm joined today by Sasha Abramsky, a freelance journalist, Nation magazine correspondent, book author, and teacher. In fact, he is a former professor of mine where he taught me writing and social justice. Something I still remember from that class is actually that I wrote a paper on why cars are bad for us, from the lack of walkable cities, back issues from driving, air noise pollution, usage of critical materials, and so on. And then I got a little carried away and compared cars to nuclear bombs. Then Professor Abramsky wrote a little note in my paper saying that maybe I went a little too far with that one. Hopefully I won't go too far in this discussion, though. Professor Abramsky, Sasha, welcome to the podcast.
It's good to be on.
So I want to jump into it, right into a discussion of current events, and then try and tie those current events into broader anthropological topics, culture, biology, evolution, linguistics, stuff like that. So this is going to be late news by the time the podcast goes up, but I want to hear your thoughts on the LA protests, where, for context, for those who don't know, President Trump has deployed the California National Guard, as well as the Marines, to California to combat protests and engage in immigration raids. Where do you think this will go? Do you agree with Governor Newsom that this will spread to other states, or do you think things contained to California? What are your thoughts on the situation?
Well, I think that when you have the kind of politics and the kind of behavior that's coming out of the Trump administration, when you have a progressive dehumanization of one immigrant group and one community after another, and when you have the kind of mass deportation that is now being launched and the kind of sort of snatch and grab operations where unidentified masked agents of the state basically ambush people in courthouses or in schools or workplaces, bundle them into cars and take them away, or put them in these makeshift detention centers in basements and so on, that you're stacking up a whole bunch of dissent. I mean, it's inevitable. When that kind of thing happens, you're going to have communities that are coming out in protest, because coming out in protest is a noble tradition. It's a noble part of the democratic tradition, and it helps us reset. It helps us sort of realize, all right, maybe the government's going too far, and the protests provide a moral barometer. So the protests are going to continue. Trump is itching for a fight. He's itching for a fight today with California, but tomorrow it will be some other city or some other state. He's itching to impose his sort of vision of a strongman rule on the country. And, for years and years, that strongman vision has involved calling out the military and turning the military into a sort of political prop, which the military has historically been extremely reluctant to be. Its legitimacy comes from the fact that it's not a political prop. But Trump is breaking down that barrier. And if you go to LA, you'll see the 4,000 National Guardsmen. There's this deployment of 700 Marines. I don't think they're on the streets yet, or if they are, it's in very limited amounts. But there's this promise basically of 5,000 militarized soldiers and their vehicles in the streets of LA. That's dangerous. It's dangerous for, political reasons, because it really does corrode the democratic system, but it's dangerous much more sort of on the ground, in that people can get hurt. The military is trained to do military things, not to do civilian law enforcement. And when you put angry civilians against a military machine, bad things can happen. And, this is the real tragedy of this situation, is that you got a president of the United States, and it's not just the president, it's his henchmen. It's people like Tom Homan, it's people like Stephen Miller, it's people like Kristi Noem, it's people like Vice President Vance. You got these henchmen around him who are essentially egging him on and telling him, you got to impose your will, you got to impose your strength. Well, it's a recipe for a calamity. Whether that calamity happens in LA or Washington, D.C. or some other city or state, it's a recipe for disaster. And, I think that Newsom was absolutely right when he went on the radio and when he went on social media the other day, and he said, this is democracy under assault. This isn't just about LA, and it isn't just about, one act of civil disobedience or civil disturbance in LA. This is a real assault on fundamental parts of the American project. So that's my thoughts. That's a long answer to your question, but that's basically what I'm thinking about this.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying that it's very understandable that these people are protesting because people are being taken away in unmarked vehicles. There's a story I believe of
Yeah, I mean, look,
entire
you
restaurant
can
being
have a
taken away.
legitimate policy debate over how to respond to undocumented immigration. That's a policy debate that's been going on for decades. There's nothing new about that debate. But what is new is the caliber of the response that Trump has unleashed. The fact that he is turning hardworking people into criminals, the fact that he is taking away people's legal status. So a lot of this, we're saying, well, they're undocumented, they shouldn't have come in the first place. A lot of the people Trump's targeting are people who have legal status. They're asylum seekers. They're people who are here on temporary parole status or temporary, all these different humanitarian status that give you admission temporarily. They're people who, under Biden and other presidents, received paperwork so that they could work and live in this country. And now suddenly that legal status is being yanked away. They're being declared illegal and they're being targeted not because they're inherently criminal, but because Trump doesn't like where they're from, basically. So, yes, that is going to trigger protests, and it should trigger protests, as should the way that politicians are being treated by Trump. Look at the way that Senator Alex Padilla earlier this week was, manhandled, shoved to the ground, and handcuffed by federal agents when he'd already identified himself as being US Senator Alex Padilla. I mean, there is stuff going on that anybody with a moral compass should think, you know what, this is outside the bounds of the possible. This is outside the bounds of the norm, and we're going to have to express our dissent. That's not un-American. That's quintessentially American to express dissent at a moment like this.
Yeah, and it's very American to have immigration as well. I want to tie in something you said too. But go ahead first.
No, go on.
You mentioned that Trump doesn't like these people. I think there's a discussion on the right, maybe 2016, 2020-ish, that said like, hey, look, we're not against immigration. We're not against immigrants. We're against illegal immigration. That was the whole talking point on the right, I feel like, back then. But now I'm seeing people like Charlie Kirk, people like Matt Walsh, these right-wing conservative pundits say that actually we should stop immigration from the third world, which I feel like is just a different way to say we should stop black and brown people from coming here.
It's a rise of a white nationalist agenda that's always been a part of the American story. I mean, look, we can romanticize the past, but if we're romanticizing the past, then we're, whitewashing the fact that we had legislation specifically banning Chinese migration. We're whitewashing the fact we had a racial caste system and slavery. There are so many problematic, deeply, deeply problematic aspects of American history when it comes to race. There's nothing new about anti-immigrant advocates basically saying we want immigration to be a white, affluent thing only. What is new about it is that in the recent past, in living memory, since 1965, when the immigration system was changed, which is 60 years ago, for 60 years, we've had a relatively humane immigration system that emphasizes family unification. So if one person's here, there are abilities to bring other people in. We've had a system that doesn't sort of blanketly ban people from certain parts of the world. Now all of that's being reversed. So we have the Muslim travel ban, which is, been resurrected. It's not called a Muslim travel ban anymore, but there are 17 countries now where we've essentially banished travel to and from. There are countries where we're basically saying we don't want your students to come in. There are countries where we're saying, well, we think you're a danger, whether it's through terrorism or through politics or whatever it might be. So we're going to have extreme visa vetting. All of this stuff is an excuse to just lock down the country more and more and more. And at the end of the day, we lose. I mean, look, this country has been made magnificent by having open immigration, or not entirely open, but by having an extensive, wide-ranging immigration system. It's brought talent, it's brought dreams, it's brought a cultural melting pot. It's so enriched us in so many different ways. And, this idea that we're going to lock down, well, yes, we can lock ourselves down, but we're no longer going to have the best universities in the world if we do. We can lock ourselves down, but we'll no longer have, all the dynamism that comes with entrepreneurs and technology specialists and everyone else who's made America their home and made America the home for their inventions and their businesses. We can do all of these things. We'll just make ourselves culturally and in the long run economically poorer, and certainly morally poorer. If you send masked agents in and you rip families apart, there is no doubt at the end of the day we become morally impoverished by that.
I completely agree. Taking a zoom out for a second, on the origins of American racism, what do you think kind of like is the reason why people are racist here? We have a racist subculture here. It's a tough question,
I
but what are
mean,
your thoughts?
yeah, I mean, you can make the argument that America was founded right from the get-go on racial hierarchies. It's a pretty compelling argument. I mean, this is a country that was founded using chattel slavery and the labor that came with chattel slavery as a sort of core part of its identity. Now, obviously, we're not a static country, and this country in 2025 is dramatically different from what the country was like 200, 250 years ago, or pre-independence in the earlier 18th and 17th centuries. But we have a long history of viewing the world through racial lenses in this country. And we have a long history of dividing our economy, at least in part, via racial caste systems. So we've had this well of labor at the bottom of the economy for, not just 5 or 10 years, but for many, decades, maybe centuries, that relies at least in part on undocumented labor at the bottom of the economy that provides this sort of cheap well of farm workers, factory workers, construction workers, and so on. There's nothing new about that. Again, what happens every so often, every few decades, you get a very nativist movement springing up. So you saw it in the 1870s and 80s, and it led to the anti-Chinese legislation. You saw it in the 1920s after a decade or two of very high immigration, and it led to the complete lockdown of the immigration process. You saw it in the late 1930s when there was this move against admitting refugees from war-torn Europe. So we do see these nativist movements crop up. Trump is just harvesting them particularly effectively. He's a particularly, I mean, I don't think he's intelligent in sort of a classical intellectual sense, but he's got political smarts. He knows how to harness, for the most demagogic of ends, he knows how to harness people's fears and how not just to harvest them, but to accelerate them. And he's very, very good at accelerating fears around immigration. So you saw it in this sort of crazy thing in the election campaign where he's talking about Haitian immigrants eating people's pets.
Yeah.
You see it today. The DHS and ICE and these other agencies are putting out, essentially proto-fascist literature warning people about invaders, foreign invaders. And there's this poster doing the rounds, an Uncle Sam poster that they're circulating at the moment, which warns about foreign invaders and tells everybody to, get involved in rooting out the foreign invaders. Well, that's slave hunting by another name. I mean, when you literally encourage millions and millions of Americans to go on a hunt against people they suspect of being undocumented, and when you then redefine the undocumented not as desperate poor people looking for a safe harbor, but as invaders. I mean, it's classic authoritarian iconography. You can't get more classically authoritarian than that. It's the use of the state for the most naked propaganda purposes. So, again, I think he's harvesting old themes that have appeared in America throughout its history, but he's using them in a new and particularly effective way.
Mm. And do you feel like the reason why they're effective now is because of his messaging, his charisma, or do you think it's because of maybe economic factors or personality factors? What do you think is the reason why it's so
I mean,
effective now?
all of the above. Someone like Trump only becomes possible in an era of deep economic and cultural uncertainty. If America's working class was satisfied, confident, secure of the future, if America's middle class was secure in the future, people like Trump would be laughed out of the house. They gain credibility in a moment of uncertainty. And we've had that. We've had 50 years of just cascading economic inequality. If you look at the bottom part of the economy, they're worse off today in real terms than they were in Nixon's era. That's 50 years ago. So you've had this collapse of certainty and then a series of events like the crash of 2007, 8, 9, which decimated the housing market and left an awful lot of people losing their life savings, losing the security of their homes. Well, again, that's calculated to sow resentment. The forever wars, from 2001 onwards. Again, one can argue the merits or demerits of those decisions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on, but they left a huge legacy of bitterness and a huge number of people who felt that they were just being used and then sort of thrown away. And Trump exploits that. Now, I mean, the whole thing is an illusion. He's a grifter. He doesn't really care about working class Americans. He doesn't really care about veterans or anything else. You're seeing that in the way that the Doge cut's being implemented. Anyone who really cared about veterans wouldn't be cutting 80,000 jobs from the VA. But he has this illusion, this ability to say, I'm the strong man who's going to make your lives better again. And not everyone believes him, but a significant percentage believe him. And, as you saw with Hitler's rise in the 1930s in Germany, you don't actually need a majority of a population to support a demagogue. You just need a well-organized minority. And Trump has that well-organized minority, and he has the ecosystem, the media ecosystem, the legal ecosystem. He's got this sort of infrastructure now built in to basically amplify anything he says. And it gives this sort of illusion of invulnerability. And actually, I don't think Trump's invulnerable at all. I think he's, in the grand scheme of things, he's a weak, small man. He's scared of his own shadow. I mean, only people who are scared of their own shadows fixate on things like military parades. Um, but there is an illusion that he is an invulnerable, strong man. And as long as that illusion holds, he's going to be able to do damage.
Yeah, that's very true. Um, what kind of steps would you take then, if you had a magic wand? What steps would you take to change America to prevent the rise of fascists like Trump in the future and Mike Johnson?
I taught you what, 2, 3 years ago, and I think one of the things I taught in the class was the importance of media literacy. That, in an era where everybody's flooded with vast amounts of information, a lot of which is false or, if not false, partially true, or if not partially true, manipulated. There's so much propaganda and there's so much echo chamber politics and echo chamber media coverage. If I could wave a magic wand, I would increase media literacy among young people so that the next generation coming up would be more able to discriminate properly between what's real and what's not real when they're getting all these social media feeds. Because otherwise, we're just living in a sort of glorified rumor mill. And in rumor mills, the person who basically shouts the loudest and the most salaciously gains the most credibility. And Trump knows that. He's very, very good at it. The big social media tycoons know that, which is why they're sort of so against any kind of control over the internet. If you have a sort of Wild West free-for-all where anything goes on the internet and you break down any notion of objectivity, any notion of truth, well, in the end, all you do is you bulldoze all the guardrails down and you leave the path open for strongmen and for demagogues. So if I could raise a magic wand, it would be to increase media literacy in this country. But beyond that, it would be empathy. I don't see how we as a society or a community survive over the long term if we shred all the bonds of empathy, if we cease to be able to look at the world through other people's eyes. I mean, look, when you're looking at people from Haiti or Venezuela or the others who have come in and, got temporary protected status or humanitarian parole from one administration, and then 6 months later, a new administration comes in and says, you're now illegal, and unless you self-deport, you're going to be arrested and you're going to have all your benefits taken away and you're going to be separated from your family members and everything else. Well, where's the empathy there? There's a reason people are coming north into America. And it's because they trust America and have confidence in America. We should take it as an honor. People are parking their dreams and their aspirations in the United States because they know that their dreams and their aspirations aren't going to be realized in their home countries. We should regard that as an infinite honor that this country is seen as the safe harbor for dreams. But instead, we're putting a wrecking ball to that. We're putting people in prison for the most absurd things, for thought crimes. We're putting students in prison who come here for thought crimes. We're deporting people to places like, or trying to deport people to places like South Sudan or to the Seacop prison in El Salvador. Well, yeah, I mean, again, those with power can do it because they have power. But at the end of the day, we immiserate this country. We make it morally poorer and eventually economically poorer. And for what? For nothing, for this fever dream of a sort of white nationalist great age, which, will never be. It's a complete fever dream. So yes, if I could wave a magic wand, I would say be done with this fever. Let's return to some kind of sane, sober, value-driven discussion of immigration and poverty and inequality. And let's return to an age in which we know how to empathize with each other again.
Yeah, I completely agree with all that. If you could talk directly to the listener, what do you tell a listener to do to increase their media literacy and be able to parse out the good and bad stuff on social media?
I tell them to do what I told you to do as a student. Read broadly, read widely. Don't be afraid of encountering views that you don't inherently agree with. Because if you only live in an echo chamber, you're not going to be very smart. You're not going to know very much about the world. So read and communicate and think deeply, but also broadly.
That's good advice. Well, in the last 10 minutes, I want to shift focus to actually poverty, which is something that you've written about before. Do you view poverty as a public health crisis because of increased infant mortality, nutritional deficiencies, low life expectancy, chronic diseases, all that, or you think that's not really a good framework for poverty?
No, it's a great framework. Of course, it's a public health crisis, not just in America and not just in 2025, but it's always been a public health crisis. You can go back to Victorian London 150 years ago, and you've got early sociologists and newspaper journalists like Henry Mayhew who were going around chronicling the effects of poverty. And those effects are manifest from lower life expectancy to higher alcoholism to less access to medical care to increased prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases and so on. If you look at poverty in America today, you see the same thing, decreased life expectancy. You see clusters of diseases, coal mining communities, poor coal mining communities, for example, clusters of lung diseases. Um, you see asthma in poor neighborhoods around environmental pollution. Though, under Trump's America, we're not allowed to talk about disparate impacts of climate change or disparate impacts of pollution on poor people or non-white people, but it's a reality. If you go to poor neighborhoods, you see a higher incidence of crime, you see a higher incidence of police brutality, you see higher incidences of domestic abuse. Poverty comes with consequences. If you create conditions of desperation or conditions of despair, people respond accordingly. Um, and there's no mystery to that. It's the same in any society, that if you give people security, if you give people opportunity, if you broaden the base of that opportunity, generally the less good social indicators go down and the better social indicators go up. And that's everything from life expectancy to crime and punishment. So, yes, I mean, whether you want to call it a public health emergency or whether you want to call it a public policy emergency, as America gets more and more unequal, it comes with consequences. So, the lesson is we should be doing what we can to limit profound inequality. We're going in the wrong direction. We're making it harder to access healthcare at the moment. We're making it harder to access food stamps and basic nutritional programs. We're making it harder for low-income people to accumulate anything like the savings they need to retire. We're making it harder for people to get entrance into the housing market. We're doing so many things that take us in the wrong direction if we really are serious about tackling inequality and its consequences. So yes, it's a public health emergency. Sometimes it's a chronic emergency. At the moment, I'd say it's acute, that we're going so far, so fast in the wrong direction that it is an acute crisis at this moment.
And what do you think is the cause of that increased income inequality these days?
People who have influence. I mean, look at who's shaping our policy at the moment. This is an administration stacked full of billionaires. It's the richest administration in history. These are people who've never lived in poverty, never experienced hardship, never, wondered where their next meal is coming from, never wondered, what bills they're going to have to juggle. Well, that creates an empathy gap. Elon Musk made this extraordinary statement a couple of months back that empathy equals civilizational suicide. That too much
Ridiculous.
empathy means, you're caring for other people and you're not looking after your own. There's this prosperity gospel that the Trump administration has latched onto, which is just gibberish. I mean, you just will not find it in the Bible that, Jesus loved rich people. What you will find in the Bible is that Jesus said, we should care for the meek and the poor and the vulnerable, and we should tend to them and we should, respect their needs and wishes. But all of that gets eliminated in the particular version of Christian nationalism that's bouncing around at the moment. Um, so I think if you have religious doctrine that is, putting basically the religious stamp of approval on politics of inequality, if you have extraordinarily influential political figures and cultural figures like Elon Musk and Trump, again, putting their finger on the scale and saying, inequality is a good thing, not a bad thing. If you have government which is censoring all reference to inequality, it's ordering, all the government databases to strip words like inequality and poverty and racism and all these other things, to literally strip them from government documents. I mean, that is a project. It's so dangerous on so many levels. But America, for the better part of 100 years, maybe more than 100 years, since the early 20th century and the progressive era, a key part of the American political project, in fits and starts, but generally over that 120 years, a key part of that project has been to reduce inequality and to reduce the impacts of poverty. And we're abandoning that at speed. We're basically saying inequality is not a bad thing. In fact, it's probably a good thing. We're basically saying if you're poor, it's your own fault. If you're rich, it's because you've done all the right things. We don't owe obligations to people who are poor. We don't owe obligations to parts of the world that are poor. As you said, we're going to sort of restrict immigration only to affluent Northern Hemisphere white countries. Well, yes, again, they have the power. So in the short term, they can do that. But in the long term, God help us, what a country they're creating if this is the vision of the future that they want to implement.
Makes sense. So, what policy decisions would you take to decrease income inequality?
I'd have a progressive tax system of which, we have a few elements, but not nearly enough. I would tax the billionaire class at a far higher rate than they're currently taxed. And I think there's a fairly good argument to be made for a wealth cap. You can say, all right, you can have the first few billion. You're going to be perfectly fine with the first few billion, but you can't have the 100 billion after that. You don't need it. And there are other social goods that would be fed if that money was available. So the tax system is a core part of this. I would have universal health care. I don't see how a society that claims to be the free world's defender can have tens of millions of people who can't go to the doctor when they get sick. I would massively ramp up the affordable housing commitments that we have at the city, the state, and the federal level. And I would destigmatize the use of public housing because at the moment we have public housing, but we make it absolutely clear if you use public housing, there's something wrong with you, basically. Well, that's crazy. We should make it possible to honorably accept social benefits like that. Um, you know, I mean, those are just starting points. you know, every so often Trump does something, and I'm like, oh, that's not a bad idea. The idea at the moment of giving every child $1,000 at birth, obviously calling it Trump baby dollars or whatever the hell he's calling it, that's just propaganda. But the concept of setting up a fund for each citizen when they're, or each resident when they are born, and hopefully investing it in education funds, for example, that's not a bad idea. Um, I think there are many things we can do to tackle inequality. And a lot of those things are things we know how to do. We're just not doing it because of political will or lack of political will. Some of those things are things we used to do and then stopped doing. Some of them are things that other countries already do, but for various reasons we haven't started. Um, but we have the money, we have the resources, we have the technology. We've got a burgeoning crisis of employment around artificial intelligence. We're going to have an awful lot of people who lose their jobs because AI can do their jobs better and faster. Well, maybe we need to start talking about basic income because if the money is being generated by a productive economy, but then you have a huge percentage of people unemployed because of parts of how that economy works, why not have a basic income where everybody is guaranteed a core, whatever it is, 1,000, 1,500, $2,000 a month? Every adult is guaranteed that core amount of money, and then they can build on that with their own jobs, their own entrepreneurship, and everything else. But why not explore the basic income? It's been done in cities on pilot programs. There are countries that have started embracing it. America's affluent. America's got tremendous resources. Why not start looking at a basic income program?
These are great solutions. I agree with all of them. We have to wrap it up now, but I want to give you an opportunity to conclude. So it seems like to our viewers, you've given the message of be more empathetic, look at more news sources, protest when bad things are happening, which they are right now, and do what you can to decrease income inequality. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
I lost you for that last bit. It went
Oh,
mute.
sorry.
But
I said anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
no, you covered a lot. I would say you are a great podcaster. Really enjoyed
Thank you.
being a conversation with you. And yeah, I mean, look, optimism is an important thing to hold. So I guess if I'm going to wrap up, I'll say, look, I've said a lot of, fairly bleak things about where we are, but there always has to be that room, that space for optimism to say, all right, there is a silver lining here, or there is light at the end of the tunnel. And look, the number of people who are saying, look, we will not be complicit in what's going on, that's got to give people hope that there are people who are saying we're not going to be silent in the face of this. We know that there's problems here and we want our voices to be heard. And I think that's really, really important.
That's a great note to end on. Sasha Abramsky, thanks for being on the podcast. I'll leave a link to your Blue Sky and your Nation articles in the description below. Thanks so much.
Sounds good. Take care.